All right, so this is the second issue. After using the large Hermes heads design for 25 years, they went to this. This will be familiar to all of you. Um, these are the initial Belgian prints. Once again, the printing plates were manufactured in Europe, this time in Belgium rather than France. And the same plates were sent then to Athens, where they were used for some 15 years to produce stamps that came out in a wide variety of different qualities on different papers with different shades of color and so forth. So really, it's a collecting area just as large and diverse as the large Hermes heads. They've never been as popular, but they, for anybody who wants to go into the details, and also with the small Hermes heads, you have the question of perforations, which exist in a wide variety of types. For people who are trying to who are following the Scott catalog, there's only one distinction you need to make between the Belgian prints and the Athens prints. If you're just following Scott and putting stamps in a Scott album, all of these Athens prints are equivalent, even though they're very different in appearance. So if you want to get into the details about them, it's a collecting area in itself. The Belgian prints were printed in all the values, including 50 lepta, which was never printed in Athens. So if you have an example, if you have a 50 lepta small Hermes head stamp, you know that it's got to be a Belgian print, and that gives you a guide as to what the Belgian prints look like. Although even those are not always the same, and I'll get to that in a moment. I have some examples that show the varieties that can occur even within the Belgian prints. So you have three different periods of Athens prints on different papers. In the first period, they used two different papers, A and B. The second period, papers C and D. And finally, the third period, paper E. Paper E is very easy to identify. I'll go into that later. Papers B and C can be troublesome to distinguish. The descriptions of the paper are rather similar. They have, if you hold it up to the light, the paper has some irregular shapes. It gives the impression of being thinner in some parts than others. The B paper is a little more transparent. The C paper is usually a little bit thicker and it looks like it has a lot of dots in it. But as I say, they can be troublesome to distinguish. Now, in this presentation, I'm not going to pay any attention to shades of color or the different types of perforations. Except I will say something about the perforations now. There are what are called official and unofficial perforations. And if you look in your Scott catalog, you'll notice that the numbers in Scott skip from number 72, which is the end of the imperforate Belgian prints, to number 81. There's no 73 through 80. Those stamps were originally listed in Scott. They're perforated 13.5. And apparently at some point, Scott decided that those stamps were not officially perforated. They were privately perforated, and so they don't qualify for inclusion in the catalog, and they were delisted. The Greek catalog doesn't go into this distinction as much. They just list all the perforations that are known. Perforations are known, by the way, on the large Hermes heads too, but none of those are listed because they're all private perforations. All right, now the different values were issued on different combinations of papers. So if you have a bunch of these stamps, you can get some guidance for what to look for by knowing which stamps exist on which papers. Here are the Belgian prints again, and I mentioned the 50 lepta. Here are two examples. Now, these are both Belgian prints. The one on the left looks more like an Athens print. It's kind of smudgy and has dots of ink on it. Now, it occurred to me this could be a forgery. And I carefully went through my source materials on forgeries. looking for all the details that identify forgeries of different types. And I could not find anything on this stamp that would give it away as a forgery. And there is actually a listing in the Greek catalog for what they call an oily print. Well, that's how they describe it. And I assume that this is what they're talking about. It's somewhat crude compared to the usual. The one on the right that's what you usually see in a Belgian print. Nice and clear, no ink dots or anything. But for some reason, they messed up and they created some that look like this. So here's the one lepton value. You see the variety that can exist. The Belgian print, and below each stamp I have the reverse showing what the paper looks like. Paper A was used only for the 1 and the 20, and it's very transparent. You see, you can almost see the design right through it, and makes this one of the easiest papers to identify. Paper B, paper C, and of course you start to see some difference in the shades of color. Now this is an interesting stamp on the right on paper E. Paper E is a very bright white. It's soft, it's very pliable. If you flick it with your finger, it's very soft and somewhat porous and a bright white. But look at that printing. I mean, that is so clear. You could just look at the face of that and think that was a Belgian print. So that is one of the pitfalls of identifying these things. You do have to look at the paper, because apparently when they did, this is from the third printing, which came quite a bit later than the early ones. This is from 1897 to 1901. They did the printings on paper E. They must have cleaned the plates. It's the only way you would get such a nice, clear printing. But then you also find that later printings on paper E are not as clear. They went downhill quickly, and you get ones that look more or less like this, you know, dark and kind of smudgy and without clear details. So it's only the early printings on paper E that could be deceptive, and you might identify them as Belgian. But you can see the difference in the paper. So that's the true telltale. The two lepta. Again, we have the Belgian print, and this is one of those colors where it's very difficult to see any details. They use this pale bister color. Fortunately, there's nothing critical about these. The difference between the Belgian print and the Athens prints is pretty obvious. I have not seen any very clear printings of the two lepta on paper E. They may exist, but once again, you can clearly tell the difference in the paper, the bright white and the soft, porous paper E. The 5 lepta stamp, papers B, C, and E, same thing again. The 10, paper D was only used for a few of them, and it's one that looks quite a bit like paper C. The difference really can only be detected by feeling. Paper D has a rough feel. It's it's a rather thick paper, and doesn't look much different from paper C. But if you rub your finger on it, you can tell a distinct difference. It has a rough feel to it. And by the way, I'm just giving you the results of my investigations so far. I'm always learning more about these things, and I hope that most of what I say is true. It's true to the best of my knowledge at present, but my knowledge is constantly evolving. With the 20 lepta, I did not show the Belgian print because I had 5 Athens prints to show, and I didn't have room in my card. There is, of course, a Belgian print, which is a nice, clear printing. Here again is paper A, the one that's on very transparent paper. This paper B has some sort of a plate defect here. I haven't seen any information about it. I'm sure that there are various kinds of freakish defects that occur if something got on the plate to block the printing. varieties of color you see. The 20 lepta is the stamp, the value that was used the most. But this may have been a standard domestic rate. It's the one, most commonly seen. 25 lepta was printed in two different colors, blue and violet. And I'll get to the reason for that in just a moment. The papers B and C, and then it was during the C paper period that the change was made from blue to violet. So that exists, both of those exist on paper C. Paper D, again, the one that's rough to the touch, and paper E. All right, why the change of color? Well, here's the story. In 1892, they devalued the drachma, and as a result of that, the rate for overseas mail changed from 25 to 30 lepta. I can only assume that the UPU required a special stamp for the overseas rate, because otherwise they could have just, you could have used a 25 plus a 5 lepta stamp, and there'd be no need to have a special issue of any kind. But apparently, and I don't know technically what the rules are, that wasn't sufficient. They needed a special stamp for overseas mail, and they didn't have any printing plate for 30 lepta. So they solved the problem by issuing a new 25 lepta stamp in a different color, and they sold it for 30 lepta. So that's how you paid for overseas postage. And, the color only would identify that as a stamp that says 25, but actually is valued at 30. And then, of course, they already had a violet stamp. The 40 lepta was already in violet, a very similar color to the one they had chosen for the new 25. And in order to avoid confusion between those two violet stamps, they reissued the 40 lepta in blue. Here's the 40, starting with the Belgian print, and then two 40 lepta stamps on paper C, the violet one and the blue one, then the 40 blue on paper D, and finally, my first forgery. And I cannot identify which forgery this is because the printing is so crude that none of the identifying details are apparent. There are various ways of telling the different forgeries apart. There are forgeries by Fournier, by Alasafi, and others of unknown origin. As I say, this is so crude that the shading lines, for example, are so crude that you can't tell how many lines there are. And it's by counting the lines that you can tell the difference between one type of forgery and another. And there are certain other ways too. This stamp also is somewhat suspect as far as it's possibly being a forgery. I need to study that.
It seems to be missing some beads in the
You're
edge
right. They call them pearls.
Pearls, yes.
Yep,
Yes.
that's a point. And another thing, notice in the top line here, there's a colored dot here, and that on all of the other 40 lepta stamps, there's a white mark, starting with the Belgian print, a little white mark in this line on the top there, and this has instead a dark mark. And then here's the white mark again, and of course it doesn't exist on this, the forgery. This is what is sometimes called a secret mark. The different values of small Hermes heads had different markings that exist that are consistent across all the printings. And they are often a key to identifying a genuine stamp versus a forgery. Although some of the forgeries also imitated the secret mark, so it's not 100% guaranteed. I'm going to look further into this 40 lepta blue. The final one is the drachma stamp, and here again I do have a forgery. We have the Belgian print, paper C, paper D. Now, these last two, you might almost think that, there's nothing to choose between them. They're both very crudely printed. And some of the Athens prints on all the stamps are very crude. On this one, I could not find any of the details that identify it as a forgery, whereas on this one, I did. Behind the value, the 1, in the tablet, there are horizontal lines behind the numeral. On the forgeries, on the genuine stamps, those lines don't actually touch the numeral. But on the forgery, there's one line that does. This is very clearly illustrated in the books I have about forgeries. So that identifies the stamp on the right as definitely an Alasafi forgery. This one I plan to study some more, but so far it has passed all the tests of genuine stamps. And we do know that some of the Athens prints are very crude. So the crudeness of it is no reason to think that it's not genuine. Also, the perforations are kind of sketchy. But there again, there are official and unofficial perforations. So really, the field is wide open on perforations. It's pretty much anything goes. It could be perforated with any kind of perforation and still be genuine. So I think that's the end.